Well, my challenge here is to prevent you all drifting away in search of a stiff drink, which you may well feel entitled to, since my good friend Mike McFall rather surprisingly compared Ukraine to Germany after World War II, which is inspiring for Thomas to think of Ukraine as the Bundesrepublik of our time. I'm extremely delighted to have an opportunity to hold a conversation with one of the world's greatest thinkers. And now that he's appeared on the giant screen, I can stop improvising and get on with this short conversation, and it is short. If you're feeling thirsty and itching for the drink, hold on, because you're only going to get 15 minutes of Steve Pinker. And if you can't hold off for 15 minutes, you're an alcoholic and should consult a doctor. Steve, it's fantastic to see you. Let me just introduce you, though you need no introduction. Steve is the Johnson Family Professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University and is a prolific author. If I listed all his books, we would have no time for the conversation, but the ones that are probably relevant to this discussion are The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now. He has a new book coming out very shortly on rationality, but we'll save that for next year. Now, if you don't know those books, shame on you. You should have read them by now. The key argument, or one of the key arguments, is that there are discernible, measurable trends that show that over time, and particularly since the ideas of the Enlightenment grew widely to be understood, indicate material progress in human life. And one of the most important trends that Steve points to is the trend or trends that indicate a decline in violence at all levels. Less homicide and less war. And as we've just, Steve, been talking about international order, and in particular Ukraine's situation in it, and as Ukraine is in a war, it's a great opportunity to step back and ask one of history's big questions, which you have been trying to answer for some years. In fact, you've been grappling with this question since we got to know one another, and that's getting on for 20 years ago. Is humanity becoming more peaceful? Steve, I'm hoping that you're hearing all this. What's the answer?
I don't think human nature has changed. I am a staunch advocate of the concept of human nature. I think we're as nasty and brutish as we always are. But we have managed to reduce the number and rate of wars because in the same way that we have addressed other scourges of the human condition. I don't think it's a miracle. I don't think that it's that an age of Aquarius has appeared. But in the same way that we've managed to lengthen our lives, we've reduced infant mortality, we've reduced famine and hunger, we have brought the rate of death in warfare down. It doesn't mean it's going to stay down. It doesn't mean that it has gone down steadily. It doesn't mean that it's gone down to zero, as my friends in Ukraine would be the first to testify. But I'll just, if I may, I will just show you one of the graphs that I have in Better Angels, updated to the year 2020, just to show you what I'm talking about, so I don't sound like a raving lunatic. But what I am referring to is the following graph in particular, which shows that since 1946, which is when this trend began, I would not make claims for it earlier, there has been a bumpy but unmistakable decline in rate of deaths from war worldwide. from about 20 per 100,000 per year during the Korean War to 6/10 of a war death per 100,000 people today, that in the most recent year available, namely 2020. So that's a phenomenon. We can discuss the possible causes, but it is an unmistakable trend in human history. I'll add one footnote, which is that one could wonder whether this is a statistical fluke. Wars occur in bursts, somewhat randomly distributed over time. Have we just been living through a 75-year period that is a lucky stretch? The answer is almost certainly not. That a couple of statistical teams, just last year, two independent teams performed what is called a change point analysis. That is, without any preconceptions, just looking at the historical record, can you identify points in history in which the rate of war went down? And both of them independently concluded that after World War II, there really was a statistically significant break point. Finally, I'll throw in one more observation and then I'll shut up, which is, does this mean that tensions are building up and we're due for a big one? Is it like an earthquake where the longer you wait, the higher the probability of a recurrence? That is war cyclical in the way that earthquakes are? And there again, the answer is no, that every analysis of the statistical distribution of wars suggests that they're timed pretty much at random, though the rate can change.
So, Steve, there's one obvious explanation for the decline of battle deaths after 1945, and that is the nuclear weapons that make war a lot scarier to start, especially great power war. So one question that suggests itself is that we're just one bad decision away from a huge jump in that line if there were to be a nuclear war. Now, are you telling me that it was something more than luck that got us through the first Cold War without it becoming World War III? Is there a reason, do you think, why we won't ever have that World War III that would completely destroy your theory and make your chart look altogether different, because there would be a huge spike in battle deaths if a nuclear war were fought?
Yes, there are really two questions there. One of them is, can we attribute the decline in war and battle deaths to the nuclear deterrent? That is, as I think Elspeth Rostow once said, should the nuclear bomb be given the Nobel Peace Prize? I discussed that hypothesis in both books, Better Angels and Enlightenment Now, and together with a number of international relations scholars. I think it's unlikely. For one thing, it doesn't explain the reduction in wars between non-nuclear powers. For another, it doesn't explain why the nuclear deterrent has been something of a bluff, because just to take an example, Argentina, not a nuclear power, defied the UK, which was a nuclear power, pretty confident that Margaret Thatcher wouldn't reduce Buenos Aires to a radioactive crater over the Falkland Islands. And there have been many instances in which exactly the situation that a nuclear bomb should have deterred, namely a nuclear power against a non-nuclear power, has had no effect at all. Now, it's possible, but those are quickly a couple of reasons why I don't think it's the primary explanation for what's sometimes called the long peace. The question is, are we living with a risk that we ought to mitigate? Is it possible that a nuclear war could be the worst war of all time? It is possible, and I think together with Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and William Perry and Sam Nunn, I think we should work toward the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons to reduce that very small risk to zero. So it's a risk that we're living with, and it's not a contradiction to say the damage and number of wars have gone down, whereas the possible damage from a hypothetical war has gone up. Both of those could be true.
Because we don't have much time, I'm just going to put a couple more questions to you, and then we can have that drink. If one looks at the world today, as we just did in the previous session, the most striking trend, I think everybody agreed on that, is the rise of China and the growing tension between the United States and China. Whether you call it Cold War II or not, it's a pretty undeniable fact. And the election of a new president in the United States doesn't seem greatly to have altered that state of affairs. Steve, when you look at the way the relationship between these two superpowers has developed, do you think there's some probability that that could escalate into a major war? Jim Stavridis just published a novel in which he imagines a full-blown war between China and the United States in 2034, and in his scenario, that war escalates to a nuclear war and sort of multiple cities end up being reduced to radioactive rubble. What's your take on that scenario? And what do you, speaking as a psychologist, think will happen to the US-China relationship? Is it just going to be Cold War II, or is there some different trajectory that we should consider? So two questions, really. Could the US-China relationship produce a hot war, or some new version of World War III? And if not, how do you see the relationship evolving?
Yeah, several questions. One is, it could happen. I think it's unlikely, but I think it could happen. And as a psychologist, I'm wary of the perils of forecasting based on narrative, on imagining a vivid scenario. That's what led to that bestseller in 1991, The Coming War with Japan, decidedly non-prescient. Even in doing our best in forecasting improbable events, we can't get carried away by what is plausible, what we can work out in the theater of our imagination. So it is possible. It would be a sublimely idiotic thing to do, which doesn't mean that the United States and China won't do it, but it certainly should set our base rate, our priors. The fact that China's economy will or has surpassed the United States is not in itself a casus belli. It means that the Chinese GDP per capita is unlikely to stay at 1/5 the level of the Americans forever. But especially since China is a trading state, it has a strong disincentive from disrupting the international trading order. That's its claim to legitimacy. It's in the eyes of its own people. There is, of course, in terms of imagining scenarios, there's the nightmare of it invading Taiwan, and the U.S. government launching a war in response. Again, the probability is not zero, but we also know that there are reasons that it would not do it, just disrupting trade and commerce, which would be the result of such an invasion and a war, would inflict a lot of pain on China, as would the Taiwanese military response. Even if it happened, it's not clear that the United States would have the taste for engaging in a massively destructive international war to protect democracy in Taiwan. I think the response could just as easily be like the response to the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 or Crimea in 2014. This is not to say that I have certainty that it won't happen, just that the fact that we can imagine it is poor grounds for predicting that it will happen.
Steve, we have to wrap, and I need to remind the audience that you can't have your drink yet, because after me, we have the great honor of listening to Carl Bildt summing up what we've been discussing. So let me wrap the discussion by offering you a bet, Steve. You're a betting man. Some in the audience may know this, but Steve made a famous bet with Martin Rees, Lord Rees, who wagered, it was really Martin who offered the bet and you took it, that by the end of 2020, there would be an act of bioterror or bioerror that would claim at least 1 million casualties. I don't know if you've settled the bet, Steve.
We have not, no.
Because, as you know, I think you lost. But let me offer you another bet.
I might have, yes.
Will you take this?
Not yet.
Let me offer you a bet in the spirit of Martin Rees. I'll bet you doesn't really matter how much, that by 2030, by the end of this decade, a war, either conventional or nuclear, will have claimed at least 1 million lives. Will you take the bet, Steve?
Yes, if we stipulate it precisely enough, you're on.
Fantastic. I love intellectuals who are prepared to have skin in the game and place a bet. So you now have the bet that by the end of this decade, I bet, Steve, that a conventional or a nuclear war will have claimed at least 1 million lives. We can decide on the stake later. The good news is that in his last bet, which I do think you lost, Steve, the stake was only $700. We have to stop now. I want to thank you very warmly indeed, Steve, for joining us virtually from, I assume, Massachusetts. A big hand for Steve Pinker. Thanks, Steve. Great to see you.
Thank you, Neil.